It happened in Britain, or so it was written by the late Madame Jessica Pope, that two very dear friends would come to their ends with an axe in the end of a rope. Now one's name was Darrell, and the other Sir Duane, and friends they had been since their birth. But now they are gone, and they shan't see a dawn from the fiery bowels of the earth. As boys they were clever, and ran when they ever were caught in the midst of a joke, and they loved to play games on the wealthier names, and laugh at the elderly folk. As they grew, they got handsome, and often would ransom the pups of young Jessica Pope. For then she was 8, and she could not escape, but her father had taught her to cope. So at the young age of 12, they were sentenced to hell. Well, that's what they called a school for the boys. But they gave it their best, and made friends with the rest, and soon they found numerous joys. Like tripping the teacher, and pantsing the preacher, and stealing their liquor and gin. 6 years had gone by, and those teachers had tried, but those poor people just couldn't win. So at the age of 18, they said farewell to the dean as he looked to the heavens with thanks, and he bid them goodbye, and he gave a deep sigh as he prayed for an end to their pranks. Well, home they were sped, with a fond look ahead at the homes they remembered so well, where the soup in the pot was always served hot when they came at the call of the bell. Well, they rode into town, and they looked all around, and everything seemed just the same. For though they had grown, the town and their homes always this way had remained. Well, a party was thrown at Sir Duane's humble home. That's the estate out at Manchester Glen. And the town was invited, and all were delighted that the boys had now both become men. "'Twill be an end to their jokes," cried the wealthier folks. "Maturity alters our fates." And they all cried hooray as Sir Darrell and Duane promptly appeared at the gates. Well, they said salutations and gave explanations of the school and the knowledge they learned. Then they said their adieus and looked rather amused that the townspeople seemed so concerned. Well, a week or two passed, and the boys said at last, "It's time that we started our fun." So when the sun had gone down, they walked through the town, and they looked for a practical pun. Darrell said with a grin, "I think we'll begin on a classical joke on a friend. Remember Jessica Pope? With her pups we can cope, and we'll come to a profitable end." Well, they crept to her house, and quiet like a mouse, found the pen of the pups they desired. Duane said with a moan, "My God, but they've grown." But Darrell said that no care was required. Well, the hounds gave a howl, and they made a deep growl, and a thunderous rumble they made, and their breath could be seen, and their eyes seemed to gleam, and the boys could not make them behave. Well, one bit Sir Darrell, and the other Sir Duane, and they ran like the wind in a storm. "These hounds are from hell!" Duane cried with a yell, as his pant leg was tattered and torn. For by the light of the moon you could see in her room the pride that young Jessica showed. For these hound dogs from hell had been trained rather well to attack at the scent of their clothes. So with Jessica protected by the guard she elected, the boys were quite worse for the wear. They were almost a feast for those horrible beasts. How could she possibly dare? Since we can't get to her, I think you'll concur that her father, the priest, would be fine. So they thought of a plan for that saintly old man, of a horrible, devious kind. They remembered the story of Elizabeth Morey, who had died some years in the past, which wouldn't seem strange, except they found her remains chopped to bits by the blade of an axe. But she wasn't the first, and by far not the worst. The gravedigger killed 12 in all. Oh, they knew it was him. Old Gravedigger Jim lost his mind at the Manchester ball. His love had been spurned, or so it was learned, by Elizabeth Morey and more. And the women of wealth made fun of his health when he fell on the ballroom floor. Well, he drank to forget, and it killed his regret, and his eyes became glossy and cold. He screamed at the crowd, it was dreadfully loud, as he turned diabolically bold. He spat on the floor and burst through the door, "This night you will never forget!" In the dark of the night, he faded from sight, but his sequence was already set. One by one his vengeance was done, and the Manchester women were dead, and their bodies were found all around town, and the townspeople wanted his head. To the graveyard he'd run when the chase had begun, with the townspeople fast on his tracks, but when they came to the well, it would seem that he fell, for all they found was his hat and the axe. Now some say he's dead, but others have said that his ghost walks the town every night. So, though the thought was quite grim, they dressed up as old Jim for a most unforgettable fright. They crept to the church, and with little research found the priest at the altar alone. Dwayne climbed to the rafter with a hideous laughter, and Darrow made a melodical moan. Well, the priest turned in fright and screamed at the sight of the gravedigger dripping with mold, and the axe that was raised, and Dwayne was amazed as the preacher turned pale and cold. Well, he fell to his knees, and with pitiful pleas he fell to the floor like a stone, and with his last breath he passed unto death, leaving his body and bone. Well, Dwayne climbed to the floor and looked at the horror of the preacher, contorted and pale. "What happened?" he said to Darrell with dread. "And does this mean that we're going to jail?" "No," Darrell cried. "The man has just died. His heart had grown feeble and weak. We'll just walk away, and tomorrow they'll say that the old man had died in his sleep." So the boys had their fun, and the deed it was done, and the townspeople ne'er did suspect. They found the priest dead, and with sorrow they said that he died in his sleep, with respect. But Jessica was shrewd and in a maniacal mood, and the boys were befuddled with fear. Could she possibly know? It couldn't be so, but she watched them with torturous tears. So the boys kept their distance, and with jokes were resistant, and let time lower tensions in town. And like they intended, suspicion was suspended as Jessica calmed herself down. As time marched ahead, the jokes, it was said, became fewer and farther between, and after some time their lives were sublime, for they had quite a royal routine. For with their manner well merited, estates they inherited from their parents, who had soon passed away. Oh, and in case you were asking of their manner in passing, it was natural, or at least so they say. Well, anyway, you see, the boys were now free to live the lives of wealthy young men. They'd throw masquerades and play their charades in their estates out at Manchester Glen. Their lives were quite fine with their women and wine, but something they both seemed to lack was a woman of grace to enlighten the place, but they knew not the women to ask. All the women in town looked fine in a gown, and a number were willing to wed. But Dwayne said, "If a wife's for the rest of my life, I want a woman with a brain in her head." Well, it was round about then that these unmarried men remembered a girl from their past who had in her stride the passion and pride of a lioness who never looked back. "Now, Jessica," Dwayne said, "has a brain in her head, and she's really quite attractive as well. I wonder if she would wed you or me. I suppose there's only one way to tell." So Darrell and Dwayne had made it a game to win the hand of Jessica Pope. They each began courting, and found it quite sporting, and each had a measure of hope. But Jessica was more than they'd bargained for, and the boys became more than ambitious. And with the prides they possessed, they became quite obsessed with Jessica, who was wisely suspicious. She knew what they wanted, but they seemed so undaunted, she felt she should give them a chance. So to lay it to rest, she made a request to lay down all the rules of romance. She quickly explained to Sir Darrell and Dwayne exactly her point and position. "You're both so polite, I just can't decide. It is such a dreadful decision. You're both handsome and tall and wealthy and all, with such money that comes from your pockets. But I must confess, I guess that the proof in the pudding would be my profit." Well, the boys were amazed at the way she behaved. She was so cool, so calm, so collected. And they knew it was required to quench her desires, but her reasoning was more than respected. Well, Darrell spoke first. "I'll quench your thirst. Half my estate is now yours. All right in my will. You get the heath on the hill, the manor, the mares, and the moors." Well, Dwayne wasn't stupid, and being struck by Cupid, said, "I can do better than he. I'll give you my money, the manor, the moors, and what's more important, you get me." Well, now Jessica was stumped with this money all dumped in her lap by these desperate young men. Now it's to say, "You're both equal in pay. I'll have to change the rules once again." She paused for a bit, and then said, "It's your wit that I find so very appealing." Then said to the two, "I know what to do, and the rewards will be so revealing. I propose a test to see who's the best at trickery, treachery, and deceit. The winner, you see, will then marry me, and the contest will be quite complete." The loser will be left with the pick of the rest, all the lavish young ladies from town. I'm sure there's a few who would cater to you by wearing fine dresses and gowns." Well, Dwayne said, "I accept and wager a bet that I'll win by the end of the week." Darrell said to his friend, "You'll find in the end that I'm harder than that to defeat." So, these were their rules, and their wits were their tools in a contest to win them their wives. And the boys became rivals in a game of survival for the very first time in their lives. Well, their minds started churning, and with deviance burning, they plotted and planned for the game. So Dwayne was delighted when Jessica invited him over for a chance to explain that she had conceived a plan to deceive Sir Darrell at the end of the week. For she had made plans to meet the young man in the church at the end of the street. She said, "You arrive at 11:45, dressed up as the gravedigger's ghost. Assuming no mistakes, I'm presuming he'll make a most haunting and horrible host." Well, Dwayne became nervous and said, "It would serve us to be careful with dangerous games. Perhaps the location deserves alteration, considering it's past and your pain." But she said, "If you're bothered by the myth that my father is haunting the horrible place, then forget the whole plan, and we'll let the best man receive the rewards of the race." Well, Dwayne said, "Don't get drastic. I just thought I'd ask it to make sure that you were all right. I'm more than okay with this game to play. I'll hide in the shadows out of sight." So now 3 played the game, as I have explained, in a wondrous web of deceit. But who's to remain at the end of the game, to be left with the dreadful defeat? So the time was at hand, and Dwayne had his plan and was dressed with the gravedigger's axe. He crouched in confessional right on schedule and had 15 minutes to relax. But with midnight so close, the church was morose with the gargoyles' looks of despair, and deep in the mist a noise did persist like a moaning of souls in the air. The church was deserted, so Dwayne was alerted by the slightest disturbance or sound. At a creak in the floor, he peered out the door to have a quick look all around. He couldn't see well, and above him the bell of the steeple was ringing the halls. And in a flash of lightning he saw something frightening as a thundercrack rattled the walls. For there, at the altar, stood without falter an image of ghostly design. Full clad in white it stood in the night with a wafer and chalice of wine. Dwayne, without breath, thought of demons and death and the vengeance of specters and ghosts. And then the old man raised the chalice in hand for a taunting and terrible toast. He then looked to Dwayne with dreadful disdain and pointed with cold accusation, and Dwayne understood there was no longer good in this malevolent manifestation. Well, he crouched on the floor and listened with horror as the preacher approached with a wail. And with each flash of light he came closer and tight on Sir Dwayne, who had turned deathly pale. As the spectre drew near, Dwayne, in his fear, burst forth from his place of salvation, took the gravedigger's axe and swung an attack on the phantom without hesitation. He swung several times and said, "All my crimes don't deserve such torture and pain." And when finally, at last, he'd finished his task, he was shocked when he saw what remained. For there in the dust, there lay what must have been a most unsettling sight. For twisted and terrible was laying Sir Darrell in robes that once had been white. Well, Dwayne backed away from this vicious display with his sanity writhing in pain, dropped the axe to the ground, and with fury unbound released all the guilt he retained. He cursed all their jokes and the wealthier folks, and the boys' school and all of their pranks. He cursed their charades and the money they made with never a thought to give thanks. Then he looked to the skies with sorrowful eyes and said, "Lord, I have made my mistakes." Then he fell to the cross with the thought of his loss and prayed for what penance to take. So there was Sir Dwayne, in his sorrow and pain as his soul rode the winds of remorse. He knew absolution would be the solution, but ne'er would have guessed at the source. For in from the night there came to his sight the image of Darrell, his friend, dressed in the clothes of quiet repose, was the man he had brought to his end. Well, Dwayne stood from his knees and said, "Darrell, please, I'm sorry for what I have done, but you must understand that this was Jessica's plan and that all of this started in fun." But the ghost was relentless and said, "You must end this with penance to God and your soul. Before I will rest, you must grant my request and pay a most terrible toll." Then he looked to the shadows, where a rope from the gallows swung in a cool winter breeze, as though beckoning Dwayne to release all his pain, a most taunting and terrible tease. For now Dwayne's remorse had run a full course and sat heavy and deep in his heart, where all of his sadness would lead him to madness if this world he did not soon depart. So in a dazed depression, he marched in procession and climbed to the top of a pew, put the noose round his neck, and with rueful respect said, "I know what it is I must do." And the dark apparition that helped his decision said, "Thank you, my friend, rest in peace." And with one sorrowful step, the rope snapped his neck, and Sir Dwayne was amongst the deceased. His body hung low and swung to and fro as his spirit departed its throne, and his eyes were aglaze and looked back at the days with Sir Darrell, with whom he had grown. Now one might believe that here we should leave, for both Darrell and Dwayne are departed. But let's not neglect one minor respect, and that is where the trouble got started. They played their games well, but if truth is to tell, they faltered with infatuation. They battled with hope for Miss Jessica Pope, who was clever with cold calculation. For since the death of her father, she'd written a charter that stated a devious wrath, a plan well contrived to steal their lives by cutting the problem in half. She knew that together they'd go on forever, playing their pitiful games. So as a lady in waiting, she started debating as the boys began staking their claims. She got their attention, as previously mentioned, and weaseled her way to their wills, then constructed a plan to deceive each man and carefully followed her kills. As they crept to the church and each found a perch, she dressed in an old suit of black. In the ghastly apparel that belonged to Sir Darrell, she waited to see the attack. She thought it was fun as her vengeance was done, and Sir Dwayne took the axe to his friend. As he cried with remorse, she continued her course and followed her plan to the end. In the ghastly apparel she posed as Sir Darrell, and threw coals on the fires of guilt, till Dwayne, drained of hope, swung dead on the rope, thus completing the plan she had built. So the ghost from the night stepped into the light as the chimes of the church bell were rung, and there at the rope was Miss Jessica Pope, as Dwayne, like a pendulum, swung. Lacking lament, she looked calm and content with the grin of a cat and its prey, and on her father's behalf she started to laugh as she looked at the men she betrayed. She said, "You were fools. I used you like tools to achieve all I ever desired. I led you astray, and I really must say that I found very little required. What I really find funny is I'll inherit your money, your estates, and your horses, and more." And then she confessed, "With your death I am blessed. This Sir Darrell and Dwayne I adore." So with pomp and pride she turned with a stride and departed this den of decay. For the bells of the steeple would awaken the people, and she knew that she mustn't delay. She must return to her home and wait there alone for the word that her suitors were dead. Through the dark of the night she faded from sight. Through the moors she now carefully tread. Through trails untraveled her thoughts were unraveled as torrents of wind did arise, that swept through the air with a howling despair like a babble of cackle and cries. Her mind began drifting and sorely was shifting through deeds of the direst sort. She sought her salvation and justification in case the whole thing went to court. She said, though in jest, "Dear Judge, I confess, for the death of these men I'm to blame. But if you heard the whole story, be it gothic and gory, you'd surely see why there's no shame. I'm certainly no threat, and in the end you can bet that this town should be giving me thanks, for all that I've done, and I admit it was fun, was playfully ended their pranks. She laughed with delight as she kept out of sight, with the light from her home just ahead. In the glow of the fire she soon would retire, with the comfort of down in her bed. She surveyed the grounds, and when no one was found, she approached with an air of respect. The look on her face was of style and grace, and her posture was pure and erect. She opened the door and turned to be sure her arrival had not been detected, then turned to the room, and there, in the gloom, she saw what she sorely neglected, for her mind was so rotten that she had forgotten, while planning the death of her foes, that her hound dogs from hell had been trained rather well to attack at the scent of their clothes. Her death had been short, it read in report. The dogs had been quick and concise. In those the scene said her clothes were torn clean, and her body was colder than ice. The look in her eyes sent many to cry with the horror they saw in her face, as if the devil himself had stolen her wealth and left her to die in disgrace. So now Jessica's dead, but her father had said, "Remember to live and let live." But with mortal revenge, she gave in the end and became what she could not forgive. So now one can see to live and let be is how Jessica should have existed. But when confronted with hate, she gave in to debate and received what she should have resisted. But each to his own. With this tale I've shown just the late Madam Jessica Pope, and two very dear friends that came to their ends with an axe and the end of a rope.